we'll analyze the role of journalism in socio-cultural exchange in India. So to begin with, we understand that public communication process in the society was carried on various platforms in which journalism is the major one. Journalism is the profession of carrying out information from various sources of public with the main objective is to serve the society. So in trying to after having said that, media has also been influenced by the social developments and the rapid and remarkable developments in technology and global economics. And the various forms, as you know, we have traditional and electronic media and also including the social media. So, society is influenced by media in so many ways. That is what we understand. Also, we understand that media is considered as the mirror of the society. The media affects people's perspective. Too much of intervention of media in everything is a matter of concern. So media can be considered as a watchdog of a political democratic societies. The important features of journalism are free press and free speech. Both these concepts are impactful in our society, and most of they are the fundamental rights being given by the Indian Constitution also. So what is the journalism and its role in the society? Yeah, society is concentrated on various social activities which link all the people in the society. So journalism is a profession which records all information required for the people about the activities. To trace out the origin of journalism, one has to know the importance of the news. The information required by various segments of society is collected, processed, and distributed. Therefore, this is called as a news. The profession of news activities has come to be known as the journalism. The English word news developed in the 14th century as a special use of a plural form of the new. Whatever information that the journalism thought new and audience may find new was news. Over the time, format of delivery evolved from the public speeches to include printed in newspapers, magazines, telegraphs, radio, television, and the most recently the online platforms. Acta Diurna, that is Daily Acts, called as the first daily newspaper, was published in 131 BCE to about 222 CE, Rome, 535 years. It was the daily official notices of the Roman government inscribed in Latin on stone or metal plates and posted in public places. When paper was used for writing, people also published their writings, poetries, and even letters. Journalism as an occupation became mass media with the invention of modern printing press. Johannes Gutenberg started the printing press around 1440 AD in Germany, then the Holy Roman Empire, which gave a birth to the mass media and changed the world. The three inventions by the Gutenberg were remarkable, and they were the reusable lead letters, screw press to hold paper tightly, and oil-based ink paved the way for commercial production of the printing. So Galileo Marconi and colleagues in 1901 used a wireless radio transmitter to signal from the United States to Europe. By 1907, his invention was widely in use for the transatlantic communication. So the first radio broadcast was made in November 1920 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Marconi's invention was quickly adopted by the news business for the dissemination of current events to the public in numbers previously unthinkable. The technology behind television emerged in 1920, and the first commercial TV broadcast made in 1945 in New York. 1941 in New York. Like radio, television was quickly adopted as a medium for journalism. With many today networks around, we have large entirely a television journalism, including CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, NDTV, etc. A few to say. So the course of the events in the society also helped journalism and thrive, survive, and grow. Dennis Maxwell, in his book Journalism and Society, explains the theoretical issue about journalism and the level of society. So journalism is involved in all our major public events. Prominent actors in society use journalism for their own works. Principal values of society transferred to journalism are in turn supported. The justice system depends on publicity from the media. Journalism exerts pressure for accountability, and society exerts pressure in kind in return. So let us understand what is journalism as social production and social construction of reality. What is social production? Social production is defined as a result of coordinated groups with lots of people doing large, meaningful projects, mostly without a traditional leader organization. So, social production is formed when people decide to find some solutions to the problem from their living conditions. Journalism as social production can be defined as the combined work of the different people involved, like owners and journalists. The media do not simply and transparently report events which are naturally newsworthy in themselves. News is the end product of the complex process which begins with the systematic sorting and selecting of news and topics. News production is routinized in several ways. News stories use familiar formats and subgenres which vary by topic. Rituals of objectivity, such as pairing a quotation from one group with a quotation from the competing group, dictate the construction of most of the news narratives. The objective of social production of journalism is news reporting that focuses on the responses to the social issues as well as problems themselves. Solution stories anchored in credible evidence explain how and why responses are working or not working. The goal of this journalistic approach is to present people with a truer, more complete view of these issues, helping to drive them more effective citizenship. The function of journalism is communication. So news coverage is shaped by the television. New companies and newspapers are organized. This can be illustrated in number of ways. Financial constraints, example, sending personal overseas and booking satellite connections. The amount of time available for a news bulletin or the column space in a newspaper. Deadlines, newspaper by the very nature are dated and all news include usually happen the day before. Television news is more immediate and often broadcast as it happens. Audiences, the content and the style of the news program is often dependent on the type of the audience. So in social production of news, what is that goes? According to Herman and Chomsky, we see that various interests affects the process. There will be set of news filters like the size, concentrated ownership, owner health, and profit orientation of the dominant mass media firms. Advertising as the primary income source of the mass media, the reliance of the media on information provided by the government, business, and experts funded and approved by these primary sources and agents of power, flag as a means of disciplining the media, anti communism as a national religion and control mechanism. These elements interact with and reinforce one another. The raw material of news must pass through successive filters, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. Then we see the Stuart Hall et al. In 1978 says that these two aspects of the social production of news, the bureaucratic organization of the media, which produces the news on specific type of categories, and the structure of the news values, orders the selection and ranking of particular stories with these categories. The third aspect is that the movement of the construction of the news story itself is equally important. This involves the presentation of the item to its assumed audience in terms which, as far as the presenters of the item can judge, will make it comprehensible to that audience. If the world is not to be represented as a jumble of random and chaotic events, they must be identified. Social production of news always has a gender bias. News organizations have historically been male dominated and tend to divide journalists by gender, assigning men to hard topics like military, crime, and economics, and women to soft, humanized topics. So, what is social construction of reality? The social construction of reality is a very basic premise for how and why individuals view the world in a certain manner and what role the media is playing in shaping that view. While reality incorporates the notion of having an objective independent existence or occurring in fact, the social construction of reality accepts at its very nature a subjective experience. The concept of social construction of reality targets arguably the most dramatic and fundamental possible effect of the mass media to suggest that media actually represents the public knowledge. So, inevitably, the media even create an entire culture, the pop culture, which contains the taste of the majority of the public. The media create and spread symbols that become the basis of our shared understanding. Some form of media discourse allow competing constructions of reality to appear. For example, advertisers find new and creative ways to sell us products we don't need and probably wouldn't want without their prompting. Next, social networking and social construction. While Facebook encourages us to check in and provide details of our day through online social networks, corporations can just as easily promote their products on these sites. That is, we think we are reading objective observations when in reality we may be buying into one more form of advertising. Facebook, which started as a free social network from college students, is increasingly a monetized business, selling you goods and services in subtle way. But chances are you don't think of Facebook as one big online advertisement. What started out as a symbol of coolness and insider status, unavailable to parents and corporate shells, now promotes consumerism in the form of games and fandom. Then, what are the various approaches to press sociology? There has been a debate about the relationship between media and society, especially since the mass media developed in the late 19th century. Various theoretical approaches have been employed, drawing on different discipline and area of studies. Fundamental to media research has been understanding of human communication with basic questions about who says what using what channel to whom with what effect underpinning different perspectives. Sociological inquiries into journalism have considered journalism as the product of cultural, economic, political, and technological forces in different times and space. This has brought questions of power, control, structures, institutions, class, and community. All concepts that led to the creation of an area often called media sociology. So, the sociology of journalism have several objectives of inquiry. First is examining situation and larger cultural differences of journalism, then analyzing systematic complexities in which journalism arises, that is, in terms of technological formats and change, events, normative crisis, or organizational structures. Then, third is eliminating intended and unintended consequences of practical routines of journalism. Then, exploring long term patterns of professional, institutional, and organizational changes in the journalism. Therefore, press sociology or sociology of mass media examines the institutions, the products, and audience of broadcast, print, and more recently online media. Its origins can be traced back to the traditional or governing early American and European sociological thinking, which recognized the growth and influence of the media, that is, the press specifically, as important to the transforming or modernizing of the society. Since then, however, media sociology has developed primarily outside of mainstream sociology in departments of media, communication, and journalism. So, mass society approaches have been influenced in media society. The Marxist Frankfurt School, Adorno, Hockmeyer, Maskew saw the mass media as industries used to control the masses. The media contribute to the survival of capitalism by encouraging the working class to be a passive recipient of the dominant ideology, allowing control and maintenance of the capitalist values. Ideological control, in a sense, the approach saw media or their messages as supporting those in the power, conveying a false view of reality, encouraging passivity and acceptance of the status. Then we see that there is a effects research approach reflecting sociology and psychological interest. Then cultural and social cultural approach pays attention to both messages and audiences. Then ritual communication approach says that media plays a significant role in reproducing the rituals and collective ideas common to the people. Then here, we also see that, dominant discourse approaches proposed by Michael Foucault says that discourses are observed as offering claims to the truth. And media sociologists who follow this approach examine media content as sites of contest between different truth claims or discourses. But there are certain limitations for the approaches of press sociology. Early critics deplored the effects of mass media, seeing packaged popular culture as inferior. Their views reflected critical anxiety about the media, apprehension about mass society that grew as media industries developed. The actual abundance and seeming diversity of many old and new forms of media seem only to undermine the validity of a mass media theoretical approach. In particular, the new digital media gives rise to a diverse group counters to the central mass media approach. Then let us understand the realistic economic approach. The economic approaches increasingly now play a greater role in media and communication policy making. These approaches are being used in the belief that economic analysis offers a fundamentally important means for studying choices and alternatives and their potential outcomes under a wide variety of conditions and settings. Economic approaches apply a variety of perspectives, models, and theories to inform choices involving media structures. So, media, as we understand, provides both types of market at the same time. So, let us understand the economic principles of media markets. First, media still differ according to whether they have fixed or variable cost structures. Media markets have an increasingly multiple income character, especially on the internet platform. Media based on advertising revenue and are more vulnerable to unwanted external influence on content. The realistic economic approach is the outcome of the influence of globalization and the trends to deregularization and privatization of the media. This was evolving three phases. The first phase is emerging communication industrial policy, lasting from the later 19th century until the Second World War. In this phase, we see that there was no coherent policy except protecting the interest of the governments and the nation, and at the same time promoting the industrial and economic development. The second phase, which is called as a public service. This was when new ideas of welfare were introduced for the first time in the press and with the scope of public policy in order to limit the power of the monopoly of the owners. Then the third phase is called the new paradigm, which is the result of the trends of internalization, digitalization, and convergence. Then let us see the organizational and cultural approach. It focuses on three levels. Organizational and cultural approach focuses on the three levels. One, the relationship between individual journalist and editorial board. The relationship between the news organization and other organization. Then the relationship between the news organization and the society. All organizations have specific common characteristics, namely organizations are directed towards a specific long-term goal. They have introduced and adopted some sort of order or structure and have thereby established certain rules. And the more complex organization, the easier is coordination of its activities and use of certain resources in a way that it can achieve a long-term economic goal. Then cultural approach. Cultural studies have initially been focused on subjectivity of readers and audience of mass media. It was done to examine the ideological, political, economic impact of the news as part of the global cooperative communication. Then this approach states that determining the meaning of news is based on the relationship between ideas and symbols. Journalistic reporting in a modern manifestation of culturally coded and culturally relevant stories. This approach emphasizes that understanding of culture and cultural practices are the key factors to understand the form and content of journalism because culture is the mediator between all social practices. Then, if we see what journalism and social culture change is undergoing in India, let us understand what exactly it means and what it is. Dennis McWell has described media as an engine of change. Media can strengthen moral and spiritual values in the cross-cultural and multi-dimensional society. In agro-based society in India, media can educate people for bringing awareness regarding sustainable development. Two experiments in rural television were conducted in 1970s with the prime objective of site and Kheda communication launched in 1975. When the Indian economy was liberalizing starting in 1991, a number of international players were seeking to enter the Indian media sector, with the most prominent being the Star Network by Rupert Murdoch. The television and radio, which were previously under the direct or indirect control of India, was now able to host a lot of content from abroad. A lot of content from markets such as US and UK was suddenly accessible to India. The movies, music, television content flooded the Indian markets along with others in the Southeast Asia like never before. The imbalance in information flow between the global north and global south also meant that news content from the west was present in abundance, and events covered in the west would get featured in the news cycle, also owing to India's diplomatic interest with other nations. This also aided in providing exposures to the world outside of India, thereby abetting the process of socio-cultural convergence. The impact of journalism can be judged only in the perspective of current developments and pace of change in the country. Journalism India has done a reasonably good job highlighting the issues of poverty, corruption and unemployment, and other political issues like corruption. The society is influenced by cultures and media, and also the media, which shape the public consciousness. Media is indeed the means of cultural dependency. The national and regional media groups in India play an important role in the preservation of Indian cultural identity. So, thus, we understand that journalism and society started with the growth of a speech and free press. Origin of journalism is the first phase of social development. Printing press by Gutenberg made it possible to have multiple copies of the same text, which enhanced the capacity of the reach of the print media. Then came the radio in the 20th century, enabling the start of digital media and was loved instantaneously. Television was yet another, step towards a giant leap in the electronic means of media. And now the modern day era makes the internet the most accessible means. So, social production of news is the combined work of journalists and owners, which is aimed at finding solution to the social problems. The selection of news in this process is decided by the news value and newsworthiness. Social production of news is often impacted by media bias, where journalism role in social construction of reality is seen as presenting information with some intervening factors which become a popular culture. Then we have seen also the various approaches to press sociology, enlighten about how various media like print, electronic, film, and digital influence the society in multiple ways. Next, let us talk about the news values in perspective. So here we will understand the and assess the problems of the fact finding, then handling how to explain the handling of sources for getting different views, analyzing the changing concept of news values, and describing the news values of the third world, and discuss the news values of rationality, fact journalism, and stress of writing good stories. So, what are news values? News values are general guidelines or criteria which determine the importance of a news story. They explain why story interests in its audience and how editors and other journalists decide that one piece of information and which is called as news, while others it is not called as a. So, media outlets include, as you understand, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, and the internet. News values are also called news criteria for news factors. The major positive effect of implementing these values is presenting facts. Journalists encounter many problems in finding facts. The prominent way of collecting facts is handling sources. Multiple sources are the general way of collecting right information. Sources tend to change their view in certain circumstances where the veracity of journalists leads to a good story, that is verification of the facts. The method of communication transfer have changed in recent times, so with the technological advancements. So there are some also divergent news values for third world countries, which highlight regional centric angles. Now, what are the problems we face in fact finding? A fact is something that you know is true. You can prove it. A fact can be defined as something said to have happened or supposed to be true. However, a journalist, you need to know the reliable statements are before you report to them as fact. This determines how you present them to your readers, viewers, or the listeners. The criteria for selecting newsworthy facts, known as criteria of newsworthiness or news values, consists of a group of elements by which the information deals with the uh, uh, all kinds of ways forced into the journalistic environment every day. According to the prominent journalist and intellectual Walter Lippmann, news and truth are not the same thing and must be clearly distinguished. The main problems faced by a journalist in finding facts are getting the right sources, avoiding bias, managing balance, accuracy. So facts are incredibly, slippery. Studies of press accuracy routinely find mistakes, sometimes many of them in news media reports. This means that when journalists, even the best ones, think they are getting it right, they are allowed often to wrong. Errors are inevitable, but the best defense against them is the constant vigilance. So, getting the right sources. Journalists should deal in a reliable fact, so it is important that your sources are accurate. So some of them, they might have a different sources of information. So some of them will give you very accurate information, and these sources are called as reliable sources. Other are less reliable but still useful, while some hardly can be trusted. The main factor for judging sources of information is their reliability. So, avoiding bias. So, recognizing and seeking to limit the power of inevitability of human bias is not only an is indispensable component of producing quality journalism, but it is also critical for consumers and sharers of news and information. Bias is a prejudice or favor for or against an individual or a group. It is an often an inaccurate and unfair judgment. So it's normal, although it is not desirable. There are some sociological factors which lead to bias, like background and upbringing, personal experiences, societal stereotypes, cultural context. Then we have to manage the balance. Balance in journalism is considered one of the most important characteristics of any news piece. Balance is ethical imperative of a journalist to transmit the news in impartial manner. Accuracy plays a particularly important role with regard to the factuality of the journalistic discourse. The journalistic truth is a process that begins with the professional discipline of assembling and verifying facts. Then journalists try to convey a fair and accurate and reliable account of their investigation. So different views of the same event. Yeah. Getting different views of the same event can be done in a systematic way. First, presenting both sides of a news item, then multiple source, then verification. Then different views from the same source. News writing depends on information, as we said. The quality of writing is tied to the quality of the information. It is more likely that a journalist is faced with a critical or vital issue of getting different views from the same source. It may become a privilege for the journalist to get a different views from the different source or lead to providing incoherent news stories. So the situation of getting different views from the same source can be categorized as cross-checking, same source talking to different journalists, apprehensions on the part of the source, follow-ups from the source. So what is cross-checking? Cross-checking is when the reporter tries to cross check with the source or when the story is presented to the source of confirmation, whether the reporter tries to collect additional or more information from the source. There may be more psychological or emotional issues in expressing different views of the same issue by the same source. There should be a specific reason for checking material with a source. For example, does a background fact the source gave seem questionable? Is there something in the story that could endanger the source? So there has been a growing acceptance of an idea that it's more important to be accurate than to be an independent. Same source talking to different journalists. This happens when the source is contacted in different places by the different journalists. They may occur because of the veracity of the journalist who can get more information from the person. Then apprehension on the part of the source. There is also a problem of getting different views because of the fear of the source being victimized. This happens in basically in the investigative reporting. Follow-ups from the source. In some interesting and live topics which can continue, yeah, for long period, it is suggested to get more information from the same source. This follow-up information may provide different views from the same source on the basis of new evidence. Now, there are some changing concepts of the news value. Newsworthiness or news value is a term discussed by many linguistic sociologists and many research dealing directly or indirectly with the field of media studies. A classical definition of what constitutes news value was developed by two Norwegian social scientists, Johan Galtung and Mary Hombio Rowe, and officially published back in 1965. Now, Galton and Rowe's list of news values are open to question. Several attempts to revise the list of criteria have been made. News values have remained much the same over the decades. The dominance of celebrity and social news, the blurring of the boundary between news and reality shows, and other popular culture, and the advent of citizen journalism may suggest that the nature of news and news values are evolving, and that traditional models of news process are now only partially relevant. However, successive writers have adapted their analysis to provide a simpler and more up-to-date set of criteria. The following are the recognized as well as evolved news values: frequency, negativity, familiarity, unambiguity, personalization, meaningfulness. then reference to elite nations and reference to elite persons. Apart from that, conflict, consonance, continuity, competition, predictability, time constraints, and news organizations' agenda are also part of it. Then let us see what do you mean by news values of the third world and how do they change. So differences and inequalities characterize the social, political, and economic structures and institution of the world. The unequal strength of the nation results to domination of the less powerful nations by the powerful ones. In fact, the world global system is characterized with imbalances and inequalities. These imbalances and inequalities affect international news and information flow. Galton's and Root's theory has rarely been tested in cultural context other than the Western industrialized countries of Europe and North America. News values are not universal and can vary between different cultures. Among the many lists of news values that has been drawn up by scholars and journalists, some attempt to describe news practice across cultures, while others have become remarkably specific to the press of certain nations. In Western practice, decision on the selection and prioritization of news are made by editors on the basis of their experience and intuition. Historically, the term Third World was coined during Cold War to distinguish those nations that are neither with the West nor with the East. Today, the term is often used to describe the developing countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. While the Western conception of news as a commodity took shape in the age of 19th century colonialism, the development doctrine of news as a social good was developed in the host of third world nations during the 20th century. Then, over the past few years, efforts have been made in the third world to develop some set of news values as alternative to those of the first and second worlds. News values of the third world are broad and varied. The third world news values prioritize development, national integration, social responsibility, and education. William Hackton, Development Theory of Press, Jack Lule, Three Worlds New Model, and David Robbie, Four Worlds, identify different issues of news values. So let us look into it, what they are. First is development, then second is national integration, then social responsibility and education. So in post-Cold War politics, entering an era of so-called war on terror, news values definition boundaries became blurred and it was no longer easy to position some countries into three simplistic characters of West, East, and Third World. That is, West has objectivity, it has collective agitator, and the third one has a nation building. The rational nature of the news. Rationality is the traditional nature of news in presenting the facts. Rationality leads to impartiality. The rational nature of news is the best quality that a good journalist can manipulate. Wilbur Cram, in his article titled The Nature of News, says that the news exists in the minds of the people. It is the rational construction of the events by the journalist. The first stage in the rationality process is that the news is put together, collecting information from various sources and also from their own knowledge of the reporter. Then the collected information is given shape according to the demands of the transmission platforms. Then prejudging and labeling. It is unfortunate that there is a chance of prejudging and labeling while deciding the newsworthiness of a story. This happens because of the bias of the journalist or the emotional status of the journalist. There is a chance of prejudicing by the journalist when he totally believes the source is convinced by the information. The journalist may come to the logical conclusion on the basis of the supplied information. But this becomes a controversial issue in a sensitive stories where legal and religious matters are involved. For example, journalists raise a news item anticipating the course of a trial. It will be prejudicing the outcome. While it is entirely appropriate for a journalist to report or comment on pending case in journal types, any attempt to predict the outcome of a trial or offer odds on particular outcomes would attempt to contempt. Labeling. Labeling is news media often use labels and titles to describe people, places, and events. In many places around the world, one person's friend is another person's enemy. A person can be called an ex-con or be referred to as someone who served time for a drug charge. It may be justified that if the journalist labeling is right choice, but if there are any biased label, then item loses its credibility. So that should be avoided. Now let us understand what is fact journalism. Fact journalism refers to the standardized news coverage that one can cover when reporters from multiple news organizations cover the same event and arrive at a consensus as to the most newsworthy aspect of the event. It has also been called as a group thinking. So overall, the occurrence of the fact journalism is largely due to the reporters' reliance on one another for news tips and use of one single source for their information. Groupthink occurs as the journalists are constantly aware of what others are reporting and an informal consensus emerges on what is newsworthy. While fact journalism has had a presence in news reporting for quite some time, it initially gained meaning in political journalism surrounding the campaign of 1972 presidential election. Since then, it has continued to become more prominent in reporting and more common for news organization. A significant short-term consequences of journalism, for fact journalism, is that in turns it turns minor news stories into national headlines. While these stories might be worthy of coverage, their widespread influence on the public causes people to lose sight of the important newsworthy stories else in the world. A major long term consequence of this kind of journalism is that it reduces news reporting to a competition with news organizations competing over breaking news. This results in public missing out on important news. Readers and viewers of the news might not take this kind of reporting seriously, and they might feel that the news is not so reliable and not a reliable source of information. Then tunnel vision. It is the tendency of onto a certain belief when evidence points elsewhere. It is the responsibility of a journalist to see outside and beyond the tunnel and collect different facts of opinions. So, how can you avoid the tunnel vision? Look for by looking for original content, solicit other opinions. So tunnel vision as news value sometimes give positive outcome like concentrating on the single issue, not being distracted by the contradictory opinions. Coping for good, coping with pressures for good stories. We have to understand that the cost of producing stories largely comes down to various deadlines, budgets, and type of media. Creating a good story means finding and verifying important or interesting information and then presenting it in a way that engages the audience. Good stories are part of what makes journalism different and more valuable. To produce good story, a journalist must cope with the stress of deadlines, perfection, or dealing with sometimes rude, aggressive, even threatening people. Journalists often cover graphic or horrifying events and sometimes feel overworked and overstressed. Journalists also encounter stress from the employers and advertisers while writing a good story. The journalist will need to persuade them of the danger regarding this. They can come under pressure for their own strong beliefs. Following the professional code of the ethics may also become a pressure if there is a chance of failure. Competition from the rivals also become a stressful factor for a journalist to write the good stories. However, the journalist should learn to cope with all forms of stress for writing a good stories. So, by planning, meeting the deadlines, convincing the boss, and ensuring the faithfulness of source can be a factors to cope the stress and produce the better news item. Thus, we understand and we come to the end of the topic of the news values. And what we have learned is about the news values give quality to news stories. News values are integral to every facet of journalistic decision making practice. Journalists' ability to capture and deliver factual information is central to the sense of professionalism and their societal and democratic functions. So, the journalistic truth is a process that begins with the professional discipline of assembling and verifying the facts. Thus, journalists try to convey a fair and reliable account of their meaning, subject to further investigation. Also, we have understood that sources provide different views of same information. Multiple sources give various angles to the news stories. These sources include official records, publications, broadcasts, officials in government or business, organizations or corporations, witness of crime, accident, or other events. A classical definition of what constitutes news value was developed by two Norwegian social scientists, Johan Galton and Mary Holmberg, and officially published in 1965. The rational nature of news is also another newsworthiness that has to be considered while reporting the story with an objectivity. The other factors, what we learned is all about the fact journalism, which is also called as a group thinking in collecting the information. Then we have also discussed about the tunnel vision, which is the narrow or the restrictive perception of a journalist. This hampers the serving the purpose of a news story. A journalist has to face a lot of stress in presenting, and what are the ways to come out of the stress is uh, uh, by presenting the story, by meeting the deadlines, and maintaining the good sources, and writing with objectivity. So these are all the aspects of a news reporting and the news values. Thus, we come to the end of the session and end of the semester portion. I hope I have covered all the topics of your syllabus, and I wish all the best for your examination. Thank you.